She's the chief of the Gynecologic Health and Disease Branch in the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at NIH. She received her MD degree from Johns Hopkins, completed a residency in OBGYN at Beth Israel in Boston, and obtained subspecialty training in REI from Tufts. She also pursued 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one at Mass General and a second as a reproductive scientist development program fellow at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Her personal research career was in the field of neuroendocrinology with a focus on the characterization of molecular mechanisms which regulate both normal and pathologic gonadotropin gene expression. She has held leadership roles in SRI, ASRM, AGOS, AGOF, ACOG, and the Endocrine Society. Dr. Halvorson joined NICHD in 2014. I know her very well through the Pelvic Floor Disorders Network. She went to NICHD from the Department of OBGYN at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, where she was a professor and prior REI division director. In her current role, Dr. Halvorson oversees a branch portfolio which includes basic and clinical studies on menstrual disorders, uterine fibroids, endometriosis, adenomyosis, pelvic floor disorders, and chronic pelvic pain, as well as training and career development programs. Lisa, we thank you for spending this hour with us today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm seeing a very small group of people here who probably know as much about the NICHD and NIH as I do. So, let me know as we move along. I had said it's hard to have a lot of discussion with these virtual presentations, but if you want to raise your hand, open your mouths, interrupt, etc., we should definitely do that, particularly with a smaller group. And some of what I included, depending who ultimately joins us, may not be very relevant. But I'm hoping the numbers will expand. Certainly, I see Alan now, Tita, joining us. He certainly knows a lot too. What Holly asked me to speak about was NICHD and NIH funding for gynecologic research across the spectrum of a woman's lifespan. And the emphasis here is on GYN research first, because that, of course, is more closely related to what I'm doing now. But I think also, and perhaps primarily because Rohan Hazra spoke to this group last fall. As you may know, he's interim director of the Division of Extramural Research, and his focus has always been on infectious diseases, particularly in the maternal and pediatric population. And so I've seen his presentation, and it emphasized maternal health and infectious disease. So this was an opportunity for you to get some information about more of the gynecologic side of the story. I must say it's a little presumptuous for me to pretend that I'm going to tell you much broadly about NIH. I do have a few slides, but certainly not an expert on that. But we'll see when we get there. So just a brief outline, we'll talk a little bit about NIH organization, about what NICHD has been doing in terms of funding, then speak a little bit about the strategic plan. I know you've heard about this before from Rohan and probably through other venues, but I'll focus on gynecologic reproductive health, a little bit about the relevant NICHD branch priorities, obtaining funding, and then what I call just miscellaneous. So as you know, it is the plural, National Institutes of Health. So NIH consists of 27 ICs, institutes and centers. The centers are generally considered to be coordinating offices, and they include things like the Office for Research on Women's Health, clearly very relevant to this talk, an Office on Disease Prevention, and then it's 24 institutes, which are shown here. Obviously, I'm highlighting NICHD because that's where I work, but there are many other institutes that certainly will fund reproductive health. Um, NCI is obviously the primary location for any gynecologic research. And I'm not going to, with my apologies, speak much about them today. And there's also nursing sometimes if it's a clinical sort of implementation type project. NINR will fund some reproductive research, but these are the few that I wanted to highlight. So NIH appropriations in fiscal year 2018, my apologies, I don't always have the most up-to-date data, or at least up-to-date graphs, but anyways, in fiscal year 2018, so that starts October 1st, 2017, beginning of our fiscal year, NICHD received about $1.45 billion. And as you can see, that is about in the middle of the branch of the institutes. So not large, not small, about it at the median. Well, how about more recent data? So the 2021 allocation did increase, it does every year, to about $1.6 billion out of a total NIH allocation of $43 billion. Again, just to give you a size for how big we are. Well, what's happened over time? So here we see 1990 all the way through 2018 in orange is the NICHD appropriation adjusted for inflation. And in fact, the amount of allocation has gone up from 443 million to 599 million, again, when adjusted. So the question, of course, is then why isn't the funding rate going up? And it's pretty simple. There have been an increased number of applications over time. The cost of the applications has gone up and has outpaced inflation. The types of science being done have gotten more expensive, and simply arithmetically, more applications, more money per application, decreased funding rate. And that's shown in more detail here in this, sorry, slightly busy slide. What you see in the blue bars are the number of applications, 1995 to 2015. So over this 20-year period, you can see that the number of applications has more than doubled. In gray is the number of applications that have been awarded, which has remained, it bounced around some, but been pretty steady. And so in the orange bar, you see the success rate. And yes, in fact, the success rate did go up during the times of the ARRA little bump that we had, but pretty much have continued to drop as expected as the number of applications have gone up and hovers around 10%. Well, at NICHD, where does the money go? Again, this was broken down back in 2017, but the ratios are about the same. So at that point, the budget for NICHD was almost $1.4 billion. And as you can see here, about 15% of that went to gynecology and reproductive medicine, with about the same percentage going to what was broken out as pregnancy and maternal health. So about 30% of the NICHD budget does go to obstetrics and gynecology research areas. What about broken down by budget mechanism? You can see here, over 50% of the NICHD budget does go to fund extramural investigators through the classic RPG mechanisms, primarily the R01s. There's another about 8% that goes to both the cooperative agreements, U mechanisms, and 5% that goes to program project grants. And people, rightly so, are always interested in how much we spend on training and career development grants. You can see here about 2% of the funding goes to T and F training grants and about 3% to K or career development grants. So this 5% is about the same if you look across all of the institutes. Maybe we're a little higher at NICHD, but where we are definitely higher is in the K awards. So there's a heavy emphasis on the later K career development awards at NICHD compared to some of the other ICs. And if people are interested, we can talk about what I think are some of the reasons for that. Well, what are some of our other constraints on funding? It's not just that more grants have come in and that they're more expensive. There are also congressional mandates. I must say, I never thought that I would speak about Congress as often as I do since I came to NIH. A lot of investigators and advocacy societies get very excited if a statement comes out from Congress saying that there is an interest in a specific area of research. And while that's terrific, the fact is that those often are really just interest areas that Congress wants us to consider at NIH and don't actually come with additional funding. In fact, sometimes it's problematic because Congress really wants us to increase an area of funding with no additional money, which requires the institutes to shift funds from an area that we may feel we want to support, but we have to meet the expectations, of course, of Congress. Other times, Congress will give NIH a chunk of change, large chunk of change, as they did for HEAL, as they've done for COVID, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it trickles down to all of the institutes. Often the money goes to, I'm not saying it shouldn't, but often the money will go to the main OD office, to Francis Collins' office, and then he decides how to apportion the funds. So for example, for COVID, there are, obviously a lot of areas there that NICHD is interested in, has wanted to increase our funding, has increased our funding, but we're doing it by pulling from the funds that we were allocated, not from the additional COVID funds, although we're still hopeful that some will be switched to us. The other thing that taps our budget are non-scientific mandates. A big one right now is a big emphasis on IT security, which is clearly very appropriate, but also extremely expensive. And so there's a lot of money going across NIH into ramping up our IT security, but that of course pulls at the scientific budget. We always need to remember that there are all of those non-competing renewals or out years, right? So we need to be cautious every time we fund a grant this year that we think about the fact that that money is now going to need to be found for X number of years following, generally for R01s for a total of 5 years. And that really also can get very expensive because there are often surprises. And obviously COVID is the big one, the emerging topics. In the past, it's been HEAL. Before that, there was Zika, etc. So those will always come in and sort of tap the sort of set aside budget, which is never enough, unfortunately. So thought I'd briefly show you just an NICHD organization chart. This is simplistic and it basically is the same if you look at any of the institutes, although they might use slightly different titles. So in this case, the office of the director is Diana Bianchi's office. You can think of the institutes as being broken into an extramural and intramural group. The extramural group is who you interact with most often. So what they mean by extramural is those groups that fund investigators outside of NIH. 3 basic categories of personnel. We're all called staff, no matter what our training. And one is program. So that's me. generally MDs and PhDs, so occasionally masters, scientifically trained, who help to shepherd you as you develop your programs and hopefully get funded. Talk a little more about our roles recently. Although most grants go to the Center of Scientific Review, certain grants are reviewed in-house. So not all of the institutes, but many have their own in-house mini CSR. Each institute decides for itself which group of grants they're going to review in-house. NICHD, essentially all requests for applications are reviewed in-house. We were reviewing all of the small business grants in-house, but we've just flipped that out to CSR again, et cetera. But I know it sometimes confuses people, you know, where their grant has landed. Is it sort of NIH-based study section or NICHD-based study section? And then the last group is the grants management group, and these are the people that cut the checks that come to you through your notice of award. Then there's an DIR, Division of Intramural Research. This is much more like any biomedical research institution. There are investigators that do bench science, investigators that are doing clinical research through the clinical center. There is our training programs. Generally, training is all postdoctoral fellowship level training, although certainly there are summer programs for undergraduates and medical students. And then what I'm just showing here is that there are two groups that are not formally in DIR or DER, and one is the National Center for Medical Rehabilitation Research. So this is an congressionally funded center. They have their own budget. Who knew, at least I certainly didn't know, that there was a big chunk of change, a lot of effort in NICHD going into medical rehab. The last group shown here is the Division of Intramural Population Health Research. And as it sounds, this is an epidemiology group that looks at maternal and other reproductive projects. And you may have seen a lot of these published over the years. So again, I'll go through this quickly. DIR, about 1,000 staff, 74 PIs, lots of trainees, 77 clinical protocols at the time I put this slide together, and 10% in Detroit. That's Roberto Romero's maternal research out at Wayne State. Division of Extramural Research, about 2,600 funded grants from 2,700 PIs, of which over a third are early stage investigators. We'll touch on them again later on, to over 400 in some universities. So I thought I'd talk a minute about our name. So it's the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. It's quite a mouthful. We are the only institute that is named after a person, which is neither good nor bad, but sort of demonstrates the power, I would say, that Eunice had with her brother, JFK, who therefore decided to start this institute with an initial focus on disabilities, developmental and intellectual disabilities. But our name really has ultimately become a misnomer. As I said, you certainly wouldn't expect us to be covering medical rehab. We certainly are. You would certainly expect that we would fund the vast majority of the child health research at NIH, but in fact, we only support about 18% of pediatric related research. Conversely, we support over 50% of maternal health research at NIH, and yet, you know, mothers are not in the title at all. In the same way, NICHD, I don't have a percentage, but we support the majority of non-cancer related gynecologic and reproductive research. Again, not in our name. Might say, why not? Well, why don't you change it? I can promise you that that has occurred to Diana Bianchi, but the fact is it literally would take an act of Congress. And I think with such a revered name linked to our institute, that would be particularly unlikely to happen. So all we can do is go out there and tell everybody that in fact we do all of this. A lot of people on the outside, including Congress, will Google NIH and come up with the Office of Research on Women's Health, ORWH. The problem here is while they do have some funds, including for the K-12 Birch program, and they do fund some reproductive research, really their emphasis has been very broadly on women's health, on sex as a biological variable, and are not really the focus for reproductive research. And so sometimes that gets emphasis sort of sidetracked. Okay, well, what about our mission statement? So, as I hope many of you know, back last fall, after about 2 years of work, NICHD completed a new strategic plan. It turns out that there had not been a strategic plan for nearly 20 years. And that generally the thought is that this should happen about every 5 years or so to really refocus the Institute in using the most up-to-date science, directions of technology, new clinical emerging disorders, or just looking for areas that we always call, gaps in opportunities. Gaps in knowledge and opportunities to pursue them with research. And this obviously changes with time. So here's the mission statement. I've obviously highlighted that NICHD is interested in improving reproductive health. Again, just because that is important, though not part of our name. And here sorry, below you see the new vision statement. The strategic plan was broken down into 5 research themes. As you can see, many of them have to do with OBGYN related fields. In fact, really all of them do. Obviously, there's embryology in number 1, skipping to number 3, focus on healthy pregnancies. Number 4, although a lot of pediatrics in that, certainly focus on puberty. In the OBGYN field, so medically, PCOS, precocious and delayed puberty, the emergence of gynecologic disorders at the time of adolescence, the unique contraceptive needs of that population, et cetera. And then bullet 5, looking for devices and therapeutics in pregnant and lactating women, both which are safe and which particular needs do those populations have. Going back, promoting gynecologic, andrologic, and reproductive health is, of course, my primary focus, where I'm most closely aligned. I will say that, you'll see in various publications from NICHD the terms reproduction or reproductive health. Various people use these a little bit differently. In my view, anytime NICHD talks about reproduction, it is not restricted just to attempts to get pregnant, getting pregnant, avoiding pregnancy with contraceptives, having trouble getting pregnant with in the fertility and fertility branch, but really relates to the reproductive organs. Again, I think that's closer maybe to how we think as OBGYNs. So it's the reproductive tissues and organs. But to clarify that reproductive health was not only reproduction as a process, we were able to include gynecologic and andrologic in this statement. And I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. There are 5 cross-cutting topics. I'll particularly emphasize health disparities as well as diversity. Big emphasis now in studying disorders that have health disparities, or at least understanding whether health disparities exist for those disorders, which has often not been looked at closely enough. Also, a lot of interest in diversity in the patient populations that are recruited, in the investigators that are doing the science, etc. There are 10 aspirational goals. Didn't list them all here. I'll highlight one of them is endometriosis, and the other is training. The other 3 are related to maternal health. So how is NICHD-DER broken up? So I told you that you could think of it as our functions were program or scientific, review, and grants management. Well, within program, about 8 or so years ago now, they decided that rather than having centers, that they would break it down into branches, the areas of research that were being covered. They broke it down into 10 branches, and then they added 2 branches. One of them is pediatric trauma and critical illness, and the other was my branch, gynecologic health and disease. And going back to what I was just saying, I think there was recognition within NICHD, NIH, by Congress, and probably through a strong push from some advocacy groups and professional groups such as ACOG, all saying, hey, wait a minute here. Women have gynecologic disorders throughout their lifetimes outside of the reproductive process itself. So so 7 years ago, I came to NICHD. Now, we have, within all of these branches, we're asked to identify high program priorities. And when the new scientific visioning strategic plan came out, we were asked to reevaluate our high program priorities to better align with some of the concepts that came out of that strategic plan. But what I want to emphasize is that just because we have listed high program priorities does not mean that we are not interested in grants that are outside those priorities. However, we have put a lot of thought into them. Again, we think that they address some critical gaps in opportunities, and we can use our HPPs to help justify funding some grants that may be on the cusp of funding otherwise. So anyways, what are the HPP areas in GHDB? Non-invasive diagnostic and screening tools. We've had small business RFAs in this area. And I think a classic example is endometriosis. Really don't want patients to have to go to surgery to make the diagnosis. It would be wonderful to have a serum screen. A lot of those have been tried and failed, but we're still trying. A new source for screening is menstrual effluent, so menstrual blood and tissue. And that's been a big focus on whether or not menstrual tissue would be a sensitive, specific way to look for endometriosis, fibroids, perhaps screen for implantation disorders, etc. We're still emphasizing omics. Early on, we emphasized genomics, but of course, we're now, I want to expand that into all of the omics, proteomics, metabolomics, a little bit of microbiome, etc. Um, we are looking for development of model systems um, to address gynecologic disorders. As some of you may know, many of the rodent model systems do not recapitulate gynecologic disorders particularly effectively. In some cases, non-human primate models do a better job, but of course they're very expensive and there are substantial ethical concerns in using them, particularly in high numbers. I think a direction that this will likely go is primarily in the in vitro model direction, as 3D models, organoids, um, precise microperfusion systems begin to develop. And we're actually working on um, a workshop um, to try to bring in people from other fields who have been more successful and are perhaps more sophisticated in this area to try to figure out how we can do this in our tissues. That'll include ovary, testes, uterus, cervix, etc. Very interested in stem cells and regenerative techniques in gynecologic health and disease. I think both as contributors to pathophysiology, as well as providing opportunities for treatment of disorders. So I think it's pretty clear that dysregulated progenitor cells contribute to the development of endometriosis and fibroids. Perhaps pelvic floor disorders develop because of inappropriate activation of local stem cells post-vaginal delivery, for example. And maybe there's a way we can use emerging regenerative techniques to convince the body to do a better job of repair after a trauma, or to tamp down, say, progenitor function in fibroids so that they don't grow as rapidly. A bit pie in the sky at the moment, but certainly coming in many fields. We're also interested in new, particularly non-hormonal therapeutics for gynecologic conditions, because as you all know, we use so-called birth control for many non-contraceptive indications, but these have a lot of side effects, including the inability to get pregnant. And so we would like to see alternative therapeutics. We have an interest in gynecologic pain and natural history studies, although we're still struggling to find ways of funding long-term studies. Everybody agrees long-term longitudinal studies are needed. One of the things we do have out now is a notice, which is opportunities for people to tack on gynecologic related questions to large-scale studies that are being done out of other institutes. For example, maybe NHLBI or NIDDK has a big study and has not occurred to them to ask a few very simple gynecologic questions. You can apply for funding to tack on those questions. So we can piggyback onto some of these other studies. Just want to point out, these are the areas of interest to the gynecologic branch. Focus on menstruation, particularly endometrial funding, endometrial biology, highlight, of course, endometriosis. I'll tell you about care in a second. I am now, part of my job is to educate people in what gynecologic disorders are out there, how common they are, and which ones need to be addressed. Adenomyosis never made the discussion, and now every time I use the word endo, I mention adeno also, because obviously they have some similarities, but likely also distinct differences, and I don't want it to be forgotten, and we're working on raising awareness there. Of course, fibroids, again, GYN pain syndromes, both pelvic and vulvodynia. Certainly not unimportant, pelvic floor disorders. And our primary career development program is the Women's Reproductive Health Research K-12 program, which unfortunately UAB was not successful in competing for this year, but it's had in the past. And we feel has been successful. The WRHR is restricted to OBGYNs. But if one site doesn't have it and you have somebody who wants to do that kind of research, there are 15 sites, and sites are open to people coming from any OBGYN training. Here I'll just point out one of the ways in which I've been emphasizing the importance of adenomyosis. I did here run a little meeting, and we've now published a whole issue in Seminars in Reproductive Medicine on the topics of adenomyosis. I'm just showing a few publications here. The other thing that we've emphasized is, just as in gynecology, there is a bit of a siloing between those that study benign gynecologic disorders and those that study cancer. We have the same siloing in our funding. We get benign, NCI gets cancer. So I reached out to the prevention group over at NCI, and we really developed what I thought was a terrific meeting to look at some of the data out there. It's strongest for the link between endometriosis and subtypes of ovarian cancer. But what about endo and endometrial cancer, adenomyosis in cancers, potentially fibroids and adenosarcomas? Or even if there aren't biological links, we at least know that we need better mechanisms for distinguishing benign from potentially malignant conditions. There are no specific requests for applications in this sort of gray area, but we're definitely talking now, and I definitely have NICHD willing to consider those grants that are, again, in this gray zone. But there are ways to phrase all of that. So talk to me as we put together specific aims if you are interested in this transition period. And I'll just say for that, you know, one of the arguments that I made to NCI was that benign conditions should be excellent models to inform the mechanisms that lead to malignant transformation. Or conversely, why is it that a fibroid can grow and grow and grow and never become malignant? Why does endometriosis have so many characteristics of malignancy? Dissemination, implantation, neurovascularization, etc., and yet is not malignant. And maybe if we can understand what checks these benign disorders from becoming cancer, that will identify new areas for therapeutics to prevent progression, or at least metastases, etc. And again, we've gotten some traction there, so I am hoping that we can begin to do a better job of funding these intermediate areas. Okay, and move on, fertility and fertility branch. Again, because of my biases, I won't go into some of these other branches in quite as much detail. Although I should say I'm an REI, so these are my clinical areas of interest. They are focusing now on early pregnancy loss, fertility as a marker of overall health. What's meant by that is that probably the classic example is in the fertility world would be cystic fibrosis patients with a mild mutation. The men may present in an infertility clinic with azoospermia due to congenital absence of the vas deferens. But that might tell us something about the men's underlying health, because they do in fact have a mild version of cystic fibrosis. There are probably many Fragile X in women with premature ovarian insufficiency. They don't have the full mutation, but are their offspring at risk for developing it. undoubtedly a long list of um, underlying health disorders that may first present in the fertility clinic, and therefore should um, perhaps these fertility causes should be better studied for the prediction long term for that patient and their offspring's health. Um, FI is also interested in omic approaches, focusing somewhat newly on the role of nutrition and metabolism and circadian rhythms in fertility, as well as a focus on early reproductive transitions. So that goes back to our discussion of the importance of adolescence in puberty as highlighted by the strategic plan. Their major programs are the National Centers for Translational Research and Reproduction and Infertility. It's quite a mouthful. This is a program project grant. We call it the NIC tree. It used to be called the SIPR. And I'm sorry, my previous slides, apparently I had removed one of the bullets. I had what was called the CARE program for endometriosis, which is Centers for Advancing Research in Endometriosis, modeled very much after this. Basically, these are centers in which we have both basic science and translational clinical projects, not clinical trials. All those investigators working in a single center with multiple, basically usually about 3 R01 equivalent projects, the idea being that because they're working together, that there should be increased complementarity, crosstalk discussions that will advance the field more quickly. This has been successful for 20 some years, primarily in the infertility field, and now we want to do that for gynecology. They run the Reproductive Medicine Network, now renamed, but this is a clinical trials, clinical outcomes network, very similar to the Pelvic Floor Disorders Network. And their K-12 program is the Reproductive Scientist Development Program, again for OBGYNs, but unlike the WRHR, which is basic through clinical training, RSDP is focused on basic science training. Contraceptive research branch, I'll just mention 2 of their HPPs. One is the development of new contraceptives. This branch is a little different than the others because their primary focus is on drug development, occasionally device development. Dan Johnston, who came about 5 years ago, is particularly interested in developing new male contraceptives, although they're certainly still working on female contraceptives. There's also a big push on non-steroidal medications, again, some of it we've been talking about in GYN, and multi-protection technologies or multi-use technologies. So these are contraceptives that also have an protection against sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. He does want to expand the branch more into basic research that will inform the contraceptives that are then developed, as well as look at the impact of these contraceptives on human health broadly and gynecologic disorders. So we're working on that, closely on that. The population dynamics branch is very different, as this really, they don't like me to say they're an epidemiology branch because they are not epidemiologists, but they are population dynamics specialists. But bottom line is this is a group that oversees many of the very large scale survey studies in multiple different areas, including in reproduction. You see that at the bottom, family planning and fertility, STIs, getting more classic gynecology questions in there too. And they work closely with the contraceptive branch because the question, of course, is, yes, we need new contraceptives, but why, for example, in the US, is contraceptive use so poor when compared to use, say, in Western European countries? So they really look at, why is it that patients don't use these techniques as effectively as they could? Why is the unplanned pregnancy rate so high in the US? Although I said I wouldn't emphasize maternal the maternal portfolio, I think I'd be remiss not to at least mention the pregnancy and perinatology branch. And you can see their bullets here, obviously. Big push across NIH to look at causes of maternal morbidity and mortality, as well as perinatal outcomes. Big push here is on neonatal opioid withdrawal syndromes. Placenta structure and function remains a big area of interest, as well as preterm birth, stillbirth, emerging interest on maternal obesity, as it unfortunately becomes a huge problem in this country, as well as the role of nutrition during pregnancy and lactation. Drew, the acting chief, has a particular interest in lactation, both how to get mothers to breastfeed, as well as what are the components of milk that are most important. So now I thought I'm just looking, briefly touch on the little bit I know about work going on in other institutes. It's not as if we don't talk to each other where there are overlapping interests, but as you've seen, NICHD is huge, and NIH, of course, is that much larger. So be glad to do my best to answer any questions, but can't go in depth. My guess is that in terms of NIDDK, Holly is probably your best resource for this, as I know she has funding through them. I'll point out that Tamara Bavenden was heading the Urologic Women's Health portfolio, and she is retiring at the end of this month, and this is the new PO. Here is their interest statement. They have interest in urinary incontinence, IC, overactive bladder, UTIs, and other causes of cystitis. A little different than NICHD. We certainly are interested in urinary incontinence, but do less of the infectious and inflammatory causes of incontinence. Looking at this in a little slightly different way. So this is pelvic floor disorders as covered by NICHD and NIDDK. The network is interested in prolapse and urinary and fecal incontinence. But I would have highlighted prolapse because NIDDK does not have interest in this area. We are always having discussions with them to try to better define our various areas of interest and to expand their interest into some of these areas. And with a new PO on board, we'll try that again. It's certainly not that Tamara didn't care, but there's only so much that can be done you have to get leadership interested. NIDDK funds a number of networks that are relevant to this area. In some cases, they're looking at males, while of course NICHD is not. And they also have the MAP, which looks at pelvic pain, which is an area of interest, as I said, to my branch. I also want to point out that while I'm showing here just the clinical trials network in terms of NICHD interests in this area, we definitely are pushing for more basic science and translational work in the areas of pelvic floor disorders, and hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. NIEHS, so this is environmental health. They have the bullet list would be longer than this. I just pulled out the ones I thought were most relevant. Obviously, they do have an interest in the impact of what's the word I'm looking for, of toxins and environmental contaminants and estrogen competing out. What's the word? Oh, there it's gone. Anyways, they're interested in those contaminants in our environment that impacts steroid effects. into the reproductive system. And some of their interests are listed here. They're interested in neurodevelopment, and this would include fetal development, environmental epigenetics, as well as DNA repair mechanisms, and all of which, of course, can impact, again, the reproductive systems. National Institute of Aging. So NIA was actually an offshoot of NICHD, now quite a few years ago. And they took menopausal transition and menopause with them. We do a little of that, but this gets to be a problem sometimes in pelvic floor disorders because PFDs are the primary clinical condition that apply to an older age group, while the majority of NICHD is much younger populations. However, it's definitely true that NIA does have an interest in PFDs, as well as age-related changes in hormone production, et cetera. So it's NIA that funded things like the Women's Health Initiative. Here again, they do have interest in the urogenital system, as well as the stem cell biology program that we're trying to tap into as we try to expand our stem cell portfolio. I'll briefly mention the National Human Genome Research Institute. My understanding is that this institute has historically been disease agnostic. They were really focusing on expansion of and improvements in rigor in genomic and then epigenomic technologies, and focus on ELSI, ethical, legal, and social implications of these new technologies, with the thought that they would let the other institutes sort of run with them. You know, we'll build the infrastructure, the knowledge base, the bioinformatics, the ELSI concerns, and then other institutes can focus on disorders of interest. They do oversee the COMP2 program, the mouse phenotyping program. So for those of you that don't know, basically this is random mutations, and the mice are deeply phenotyped and studied for where that mutation is as a useful resource for investigators. They've also had a long-term GTEx program, we love our acronyms, that was only for adults, basically genotyping, phenotyping in adult tissues. And there's now an emerging developmental GTEx program. And this is going to expand certainly into younger age groups, but also hopefully will more and more include reproductive tissues. One thing I do want to say is that I said NHGRI has been agnostic, but I think as some of their programs have matured, they have shown some interest in areas in OBGYN. We ran a meeting with them. All of NICHD did, that included a pediatric in genomics, prenatal, perinatal in genomics, but also truly preconception genomics and early conception genomics. And this RFA has just been competed. The applications will be awarded soon. And so we were really pleased that we could get NHGRI interested in an area of reproductive research, and hope to have more collaborations in the future. I know I'm almost running out of time, and I can go through these pretty quickly. I know many of us feel like the person on the right when it comes to navigating NICHD. I'll remind you, we really do have a much more interpretable website than we used to. I'm not saying it's perfect, it's still complex, but it's available. There is an alphabetic soup of award mechanisms. I can make these slides available if they'll be helpful to anyone. First are the F&T training grants that you can either apply to as an individual, or the institution gets the award and then they identify trainees. The K awards are for people who have pretty much finished their clinical training. We'll go into these briefly, and then there's the what are called the RPG grants. The classic R01 is in this category. K awards. As I said, you do not have a K-12 program at the moment there, but that doesn't mean that you can't stay at UAB and successfully compete for your own K award. These are some of the eligibility requirements. Primary is that you cannot have been the PI on a large NIH grant. Sometimes you can't have been a PI on a large non-NIH grant. So you always, again, need to touch base with us. And you do need to commit 75% of protected time. The salaries don't compare to clinical salaries, of course, but that's the price we all pay. The only thing I want to say here is that, of course, there are small to larger, so-called R grants. And there has been a lot of confusion because NICHD withdrew from the so-called parent or global R21, and we released our own. And we did that to try to focus the R21s that we were getting. But with the emergence of the breakdown in all of these into clinical trials accepted versus not accepted, as well as movement towards notices, not PAs, etc., we have rejoined. So yes, NICHD does accept all of these mechanisms. Okay, so I just wanted to make that clear. And again, there's a lot more we could discuss, and I'd be happy to discuss with any of you individually about the pros and cons as you start your career or as you go further in your career, depending on what your project is. So, timing of the grant process. What I primarily want to tell you is it takes a long time, as many of you know. When you are first planning to submit, you'll speak to the program officer. If you can't figure out which program officer, start with me and I will try to direct you. Then takes a long time to go through the peer review system. Couple more months, if you are so lucky as to be awarded, for the notice of award to come out. Generally, should assume you'll have to submit a second time. And this is at least 10 to 12 months between when you submit an application and are going to be funded. So for the junior people, if you wonder why you're always being asked, how is that application going? Have you submitted it yet? This is why, because those people who have gone through this process know it takes a long time. Briefly, there are categories of early stage investigators or new investigators, details given here. Why is this important? Well, first of all, you should know that ESI status can be extended. So even if you're past 10 years, NIH is pretty generous in agreeing to extending this. So you have to contact us, whether it be because you were delayed by medical, personal, or family care responsibilities, etc. And NICHD, like most institutes, will take your status into consideration when determining whether or not to fund you. So it isn't a huge bump, but it's definitely considered during the review and when funding decisions are made. Finally, I'll just mention, well, maybe not quite, the extramural loan repayment program. 50% success rate, right? Much better than anything else we do. $700 million put into this program over the last, I think it's 20 years. Again, I'm sorry I'm out of time, but bottom line is the following. You do need to be a US citizen, do 20 hours of research, but you can have, this needs to be updated, up to $50,000 a year of educational debt paid off for up to a 2-year period. So that's a good chunk of change to offset the frustratingly low salaries. These are some of the areas that you can apply in. All except pediatrics would be OBGYN departments, and there is the name of the person who runs this program for NICHD. Finally, I'll mention DASH. I think that Rohan did mention this too. It is also a bit of a misnomer. It is a data bank, but is currently not a specimen hub. It is not a biospecimen bank, though we hope we will have that ability in the future. However, some of the data sites do have biospecimens, and this site will tell you if they have biospecimens and tell you how to access the investigators to obtain those biospecimens. There are 180 studies now included. This is a little out of date, at least 50 publications that have come out. And this is a subset of the areas that are included. I've obviously highlighted the areas most directly relevant in OBGYN, or most obviously. Pelvic Floor Disorders Network has submitted quite a few studies, as has the Fertility and Fertility Branch, and the Maternal Fetal Medicine Unit is undoubtedly number 1, probably. I'm not going to go into that. Regional seminars, very hard for people to attend them, as they were just a few places spread out over the year. The good news now is that they have been taped. They are held virtually. They were all taped. You can Google NIH seminars and you have access to a lot of great information to peruse at your convenience. We are hiring. Again, you can Google us and find information. Particularly interested in a branch chief for the pregnancy and perinatology branch, as well as a senior policy advisor for a new office of clinical research within NICHD. I am looking for somebody who's interested in gynecologic pain too. So to summarize, use our website, contact your program officer, feel free to start with me. Do think about the high program priorities when framing your research questions, but our funding is certainly not restricted to that. And we do have a strong emphasis on career development. And sorry, I went a few minutes over. Can we take time for questions, Holly?
I think we need to move on pretty quickly, Lisa, but I'd like to thank you. Thank you for your access, for your being accessible to us. I would also just like to say to the residents, fellows, young faculty, go on that DASH database. It is a wealth of data. And if you can come up with a research question, data is there, you're able to import it and work with it yourself. The CWRH can help you with this. So be sure and take a look there. And I'm hoping, Lisa, in the next couple years, we will get back on the WRHA train. So yeah. Thank you so much.
But again, you know, the K awards are out there. They fund compared
That's
to
right.
ours relatively well. So there are many other opportunities.
There are, and thank you for
scholars to
making that aware.
Great. So thank you for your time. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.